Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story, one that is full of unexpected twists and a life-changing journey for two very different people. This is a story of a poor student and a wealthy woman, a contract marriage, and how it all changed in just a week. Mark Davis had always been the kind of person who played by the rules. At 23, he was juggling his final year of law school and a part-time job, struggling to make ends meet after the sudden death of his father. His family had been left with debts that seemed impossible to escape. Each day felt like a battle to keep his head above water, but no matter how hard he worked, the weight of his responsibilities seemed too heavy. As he walked through the rainy streets of the small college town in Texas, he couldn't help but feel like the world was closing in on him. One evening, Mark received a strange phone call that would change the course of his life. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation," the voice on the other end said. He frowned in confusion. "Who are you? How do you know about my debts?" he asked. Eleanor's voice remained calm and smooth. "I know enough. Let's meet at Brooks Bistro at 7 o'clock. It's important," she said before hanging up. Mark stood frozen for a moment, the rain soaking through his clothes. Who was this woman? And why did she know so much about him? Despite his doubts, Mark decided to meet her. He arrived at the bistro, feeling uneasy about the whole situation. The place had a sophisticated charm, warm lighting, and polished wood accents. At the back of the restaurant, sitting alone at a corner table, was Eleanor Brooks. She was a striking woman in her early 70s, with silver hair and a commanding presence that seemed to fill the room. She gestured for Mark to sit across from her as he approached. "Mr. Davis, it's a pleasure to meet you," Eleanor said with a faint smile. Her eyes were sharp, yet there was something about her that felt distant, as if she had seen much more of life than he had. Mark hesitated before taking a seat. "What is this about? You said you knew about my situation, but I don't understand how." He had barely finished speaking when Eleanor calmly set down a folder in front of him. "You have debts that you can never pay off on your own, but I have an offer for you." Mark's heart raced. This woman clearly had power, but what kind of offer could she make him? Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "I'm offering you a solution, Mark. Marry me. It's not about love, it's about business. I will pay off your debts and ensure your financial security for the rest of your life. In return, you'll be my husband." Mark blinked in disbelief. Was she serious? He let out a laugh, unsure of how to respond. "Marry you? Just like that? You don't even know me." Eleanor met his gaze with a steady, unwavering look. "I don't need love, Mark. What I need is someone who can share my name, someone who can protect my legacy. You're young, unattached, and in desperate need of a way out. Think of it as a business arrangement." Mark stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had heard of wealthy people doing strange things, but this was something else. He stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back. "I need to think about this. It's too much to take in," he said. Eleanor nodded, understanding. "Take your time. But don't take too long. The offer won't stand forever." Mark left the bistro, his mind racing with questions. What did he have to lose? Could he really marry a stranger for the sake of his family's future? As he walked through the rain, the weight of his decisions began to settle on his shoulders. The next morning, Mark sat at the kitchen table, explaining the situation to his mother. Her pale face was etched with worry as he told her about Eleanor's offer. "I know it sounds insane," he said, "but if she's willing to help, maybe it's worth considering." His mother looked at him, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I'm asking you to save us, Mark. Do it for your sister's tuition, for our future." Her words stung. Mark didn't want to think of his mother's illness or the bills that piled up. But what other choice did he have? Later that day, Mark returned to the bistro to accept Eleanor's offer. He was not sure if it was the right decision, but the weight of his family's financial struggles was too much to ignore. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor smiled faintly, clearly satisfied. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately. We'll sign the paperwork, and your new life will begin." As Mark walked out of the bistro, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't undo. Stay tuned for the next part of this incredible story, where the stakes are raised, and Mark and Eleanor's arrangement will begin to unravel in ways neither of them could have predicted. The days that followed Mark's decision were filled with uncertainty. He was now legally bound to a woman he barely knew, someone whose wealth and power seemed to overwhelm him. Eleanor Brooks, a 70-year-old billionaire with no family left, had made it clear that this marriage was nothing more than a business arrangement. Yet, something about her calm, steady demeanor made Mark wonder if there was more to her story, something deeper than just the cold logic of her offer. The contract was signed, the arrangements made. Mark moved into the grand estate of Eleanor Brooks, a mansion that seemed to echo with the weight of generations past. The stone walls, polished wood floors, and the grand chandeliers were a world apart from the small college apartment he had left behind. Despite the luxury surrounding him, Mark felt like an outsider. Every room, every hallway, felt empty, as if it was waiting for something to fill it. Eleanor rarely spoke about her past, her reasons for needing a husband, or why she had chosen him. Mark had his doubts, but his mind kept returning to the weight of his family's debts and the promise he had made to his mother. He couldn't afford to back out now. One afternoon, as Mark was walking through the massive gardens outside the estate, he found himself lost in thought. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a text from Eleanor. "Dinner at 7. We have some guests coming. Please wear the suit I left for you in the closet." Mark stared at the message for a moment, his chest tightening. Dinner with guests? It felt too real, too permanent. He wasn't sure he was ready for it. Still, he knew what he had to do. As evening fell, Mark found himself standing in front of the large mirror in his new bedroom, adjusting the suit Eleanor had chosen for him. The sharp cut of the jacket and the crisp white shirt felt foreign against his skin. He had always been more comfortable in jeans and a t-shirt, but tonight, he had to be someone else. The weight of the decision settled heavily on his shoulders. When he arrived at the dining room, Eleanor was already there, seated at the head of the long, polished table. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she wore a soft, elegant dress that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, Mark felt like he was standing before a queen. Despite their contract, despite the lack of love, there was something about her that commanded respect. "You look perfect," Eleanor said with a small smile, her voice calm and steady. "Please, have a seat." Mark sat down across from her, glancing around at the other guests. The room was filled with people who seemed to belong to another world, a world of wealth and influence that Mark could never have imagined. He felt out of place, but Eleanor's calm presence at the table gave him a sense of reassurance. Throughout dinner, Eleanor made small talk with the guests, but Mark could feel the tension in the air. No one asked him about his life, about who he was or where he came from. They all seemed to know that he was there for a reason, but that reason was unspoken. And yet, despite the stiffness of the evening, there were moments when Mark caught Eleanor watching him with a look that he couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't pity, but something else, something deeper. As the night drew on, Eleanor stood and addressed the table. "Thank you all for joining me tonight," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "It's always a pleasure to host such distinguished guests." She turned to Mark, her eyes softening slightly. "Mark and I have made an arrangement, one that will benefit both of us. We may not have love, but we have something even more important: mutual respect." The guests nodded in agreement, their polite smiles hiding the questions they must have had. Mark felt the weight of their gaze, but he didn't flinch. He had made this choice, and now, he had to live with it. After dinner, as the guests began to leave, Eleanor walked Mark to the door. "You did well tonight," she said quietly. "You handled yourself with grace, even when I know you must have felt out of place." Mark nodded, his mind racing. "Thank you," he said, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. Later that night, as Mark sat alone in his room, he thought about everything that had happened. He had entered into this marriage for financial security, for the sake of his family. But as he lay there, staring at the ceiling, he wondered if there was more to this than just a business deal. Could he ever really be happy in a relationship built on such a foundation? Or was he just a pawn in Eleanor's carefully laid plans? The next morning, as Mark wandered through the estate, he caught sight of Eleanor in the grand piano room. She was playing, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys, creating a melody that filled the room with warmth. For a moment, Mark simply watched her, captivated by the beauty of the music and the way it seemed to calm her. "You play beautifully," Mark said, his voice soft. Eleanor didn't stop playing but glanced up at him with a small smile. "Thank you," she said. "Music has always been my escape. It's the one thing that has never let me down." Mark nodded, sensing that there was more to her words than just a casual remark. "I can't play," he said, his voice filled with a hint of sadness. "I've never had the chance to learn." Eleanor stopped playing and turned to him. "Would you like to?" she asked, her gaze thoughtful. "I could teach you." Mark hesitated. It seemed like an odd offer, especially after everything that had happened. But something about the idea of learning to play, something about the way Eleanor had said it, made him want to accept. "I'd like that," he said finally, his voice steady. And with that, an unexpected connection began to form between them, one that neither of them could have anticipated. Mark had always been a quick learner, but when Eleanor sat him down at the piano the next day, he felt like a beginner all over again. His fingers hovered above the keys, unsure of where to begin. Eleanor watched him with a calm patience, her eyes gentle, yet focused. "Don't worry about getting it right. Just play," she said, her voice soft but encouraging. Mark nodded, taking a deep breath as he pressed a key. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and awkward. But Eleanor didn't flinch. "It's a start," she said with a smile. And with that, they began the lesson. It wasn't perfect. Mark's fingers stumbled over the keys, his mind racing, trying to follow the rhythm. But Eleanor stayed beside him, guiding him with quiet words of encouragement. She showed him how to position his hands, how to relax his fingers, how to listen to the melody rather than focus on the notes. As the hours passed, Mark began to lose himself in the music, the steady rise and fall of the notes washing over him. For the first time in days, he felt like he was doing something for himself. The weight of his contract, of his family's expectations, seemed to fade into the background as he focused on the sound of the piano. Eleanor didn't say much during the lesson, but Mark could sense her approval in the way she watched him, the way she gently corrected his mistakes without making him feel embarrassed. The music flowed through the room, each note bringing them closer together, even if neither of them fully realized it yet. As the session ended, Mark looked up at Eleanor. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice sincere. She gave him a nod, her expression soft. "You're welcome. You're learning. That's what matters." But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more in her words. There was an understanding between them now, something that wasn't just about the piano, about the contract they had signed. It was as if, in that moment, they were both starting to heal. Over the next few days, Mark found himself spending more time in the piano room. Each lesson brought him a little closer to understanding the music, and perhaps, to understanding Eleanor. She was always calm, always composed, and yet there was a quiet sadness in her eyes that he couldn't quite place. One evening, after another long practice session, Mark asked her, "Do you ever miss it?" Eleanor turned to him, her expression unreadable for a moment. "Miss what?" she asked softly. "Music," he clarified. "You were a famous pianist. You must have loved it." Eleanor paused for a long moment before responding. I did, she said quietly. But sometimes, the things you love the most are the ones that hurt you the most. Her words hung in the air, and Mark felt a pang of sympathy for her. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like, to have something you loved so much taken away. But as he looked at her, Mark realized that she wasn't just talking about music. There was more to her pain than she was willing to admit. But he didn't push her further. He respected her boundaries. The next day, they had dinner with some of Eleanor's business associates, and as they sat at the long table, Mark couldn't help but notice the way Eleanor interacted with everyone around her. She was poised, confident, but there was something cold about her, something that made her seem distant. Mark didn't understand it. He had only known her for a short time, but he had already begun to see her differently. She wasn't just the wealthy woman who had saved him from his debts. She was someone who had lost a great deal in her life, someone who was guarding her heart. And for some reason, that made him want to know her more. Later that night, after the guests had left, Eleanor asked Mark to join her on the terrace. The evening air was cool, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. How are you adjusting? She asked, her voice quiet as she looked out at the skyline. Mark shrugged, leaning against the railing. It's different. I'm still not used to this world. Eleanor chuckled softly, her gaze never leaving the horizon. I know it's a lot to take in. But you'll get used to it. Just give it time. Mark nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was starting to realize that their arrangement, their marriage, wasn't as simple as it seemed. There were emotions at play here, emotions that neither of them were ready to face. As Eleanor turned to him, her expression softened. You're doing well, Mark, she said quietly. You've adapted better than I expected. He met her gaze, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. Thanks, he said, his voice low. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the city below them. Mark wasn't sure where things were heading, but he knew one thing: this marriage, this arrangement, was changing both of them. They had begun as strangers, bound by a contract. But now, it felt like they were becoming something more, something neither of them could have anticipated. And for the first time since he had agreed to this, Mark felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be the mistake he had feared. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken tension between Mark and Eleanor. Their marriage, originally based on a business agreement, began to evolve into something neither of them had anticipated. Mark continued his piano lessons, finding solace in the music, but each session felt like it was drawing him closer to Eleanor in ways he couldn't explain. She was still a mystery to him, a woman who had everything yet seemed to carry a profound sadness. Despite the calm, composed exterior she wore, Mark could see glimpses of vulnerability in her when she played the piano, the way her fingers moved with an emotion that words couldn't express. One evening, after yet another dinner with Eleanor's colleagues, Mark found himself wandering the estate. The massive halls and quiet corridors felt more like a maze than a home. As he passed the grand staircase, Eleanor's voice called out to him from the piano room. He hesitated before walking in. She was sitting at the piano, her eyes closed, lost in the music. The soft notes filled the air, carrying a sense of longing. Mark stood quietly in the doorway, watching her. You don't have to stop, he said, his voice breaking the silence. Eleanor opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. She didn't speak at first, but then she nodded, as if she had been expecting him. I didn't hear you come in, she said, her voice soft. I was just lost in the music. Mark took a step closer, his curiosity growing. What were you playing? He asked. Eleanor smiled faintly, her fingers still resting on the keys. A piece I used to play a long time ago. It reminds me of someone. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He could hear the sadness in her words, but he didn't want to push her. Who? He asked gently. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she started to play again, the music flowing from her fingertips with a grace that seemed to speak volumes. Mark sat down beside her, watching her hands move over the keys. The room was filled with the sound of the piano, and for a moment, they were the only two people in the world. The music wrapped around them, creating a connection that was unspoken but understood. Eleanor stopped playing after a few minutes and turned to him. "I never thought I'd play again," she said quietly. Not after, she trailed off, the weight of her unfinished sentence hanging in the air. Mark didn't press her. Instead, he simply nodded. He understood. She had lost something, just like he had. They were both here for different reasons, yet in some ways, they were the same. "I'm glad you're playing again," Mark said, his voice sincere. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes softening for a moment. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. The music had opened something between them, something that neither of them could ignore. Over the next few weeks, things began to shift. Mark's lessons continued, and with each passing day, he became more skilled at the piano. Eleanor seemed to be more relaxed around him as well, less guarded. They started spending more time together, sharing quiet moments in the estate, talking about things they had never addressed before. It wasn't perfect. There were still times when the silence between them felt heavy, when the weight of their unspoken emotions was too much to bear. But there were also moments of laughter, of genuine connection. They had become something more than just a business arrangement. The lines between fake and real were blurring. But Mark couldn't help but wonder, was this really love? Or was it just the comfort of shared loneliness, of two people finding solace in each other's company? He couldn't say for sure, but he knew one thing: things were changing. Eleanor had begun to open up in ways she hadn't before. She was still cautious, still holding back, but there was a softness in her that Mark hadn't seen in the beginning. And in some strange way, he felt that he was starting to fall for her. But he wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. Not when so much was still uncertain. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to set, Eleanor invited Mark to join her on the terrace. The air was cool, and the city lights were just beginning to twinkle in the distance. She was holding a glass of wine, and for the first time in a long while, she seemed at ease. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low. "Maybe we're both fooling ourselves." Mark turned to her, surprised by her words. "What do you mean?" he asked. Eleanor took a sip of her wine before continuing. "This whole arrangement, it was supposed to be a business deal, but now it feels different. We've changed." Mark felt his heart race. He knew exactly what she meant. The feelings between them had shifted, but neither of them had fully acknowledged it. "I don't know where this is going," Eleanor continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to go back to where we started." Mark didn't know what to say. There was so much he wanted to express, but he didn't have the words. Instead, he simply nodded, knowing that whatever happened next, they had crossed a line that could never be undone. The silence between Mark and Eleanor stretched long into the night, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The moonlight cast a soft glow across the terrace, making everything feel like it was suspended in time. Eleanor, still holding her glass of wine, looked out over the city, her expression distant. Mark, standing a few steps away, watched her, unsure of what to say next. The weight of her words hung in the air, and he knew that things had shifted between them. They couldn't go back to what they were before, not now, not after everything that had happened. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice quiet and steady. "I never expected any of this, Mark. I thought this would just be a way to solve our problems, but now I'm starting to wonder if we're both searching for something more." Mark's heart raced at her words. He had felt the change too, but he wasn't ready to acknowledge it. They had started this arrangement as strangers, bound by a contract, but now they were standing on the edge of something deeper, something neither of them fully understood. "I don't know what I'm feeling," Mark said, his voice low. "I didn't expect to find this. But I don't want to lie to you either. I don't know where this is going, but I can't ignore what's happening between us." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The words felt too heavy, too real to say out loud. Finally, Eleanor took a step forward, her gaze softening. "Maybe we're not meant to figure it all out right now," she said, her voice gentle. "But we can't ignore that something has changed." Mark nodded, his mind racing. He had come into this situation with a clear goal: financial security, a way to help his family, but now, he was starting to realize that it was about more than just that. The music, the late-night talks, the moments they shared, everything felt like it was leading them somewhere, even if they didn't know where. "I never thought I would feel like this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I never thought I'd want something more than what we agreed to." Eleanor stepped closer to him, her presence comforting yet intense. "We don't have to have all the answers, Mark. But we do have a choice. We can either keep pretending, or we can see where this takes us. Together." Her words were simple, but they carried so much weight. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he looked at her, the woman he had entered into a business arrangement with, but who now seemed to hold a part of his soul in her hands. "Together," he repeated, as if testing the word. The idea of it felt both thrilling and terrifying. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. They had come this far, and maybe, just maybe, they could go further. The next few days passed in a blur. Mark and Eleanor spent more time together, not just in the piano room but around the estate, having dinner alone or taking walks in the garden. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, moments when the past seemed to creep in, reminding them both of the contract that had started it all. But there were also moments of softness, moments when they laughed, when they shared something more than just a business arrangement. It was confusing, but it was also real. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Eleanor turned to Mark, her eyes thoughtful. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice hesitant. "Maybe it's time for us to stop pretending that we're just living in this arrangement. Maybe it's time we see what happens when we let go of the past." Mark looked at her, unsure of what she meant. "You mean let go of the contract?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, her expression serious. "Yes. I think it's time for us to decide whether we want to continue this as a business arrangement or if we're ready to explore something more." The words hung in the air between them, and Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. He hadn't expected this, but he couldn't deny the truth of it. They had come so far, and now they had to decide if they were ready to take the next step. "I don't know what the future holds," Mark said slowly. "But I know that I don't want to lose what we've started. Whatever this is, I want to see it through." Eleanor smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Then let's see where this takes us." It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was a beginning. A beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. As the evening wore on, the tension between them began to ease. The walls they had both built, him with his uncertainty and her with her guarded heart, were slowly coming down. And for the first time since their marriage began, Mark felt like he was standing on the edge of something real, something worth fighting for. The next few days felt different. There was a shift in the air, a sense of change that Mark couldn't quite put his finger on. He and Eleanor were no longer just living in a contract. They were learning to navigate a space between what had been and what could be. The tension from before, the awkwardness of pretending, seemed to fade with each passing day. They found themselves spending more time together, not out of obligation but because they genuinely wanted to. Eleanor no longer just invited him to dinner or piano lessons now, their conversations flowed easily, ranging from trivial matters to deeper, more personal topics. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time, Mark felt like he was starting to understand Eleanor in ways he hadn't before. One afternoon, as they sat together in the study, the scent of fresh coffee filling the room, Mark couldn't help but notice how much more at ease Eleanor seemed. She had always been elegant, composed, but now there was a softness in her that Mark had never seen. She wasn't just the woman he had married out of necessity. She was becoming someone he admired, someone he cared for, in ways he couldn't yet explain. "Do you ever regret it?" Mark asked quietly, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of his coffee cup. Eleanor glanced up from the book she was reading, her brow furrowing slightly. She set the book aside and looked at him, her gaze steady but thoughtful. "Regret what?" she asked, her voice soft. This arrangement. The way we started. I mean, we didn't have any choice but to do this, but now things feel different. I'm just wondering if you ever regret it. Eleanor was silent for a moment, her fingers gently tapping the arm of her chair as she thought. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and reflective. I never thought I'd get to this point, she said quietly. When I proposed this arrangement, I was looking for a solution to my loneliness, to my need for someone who could be by my side. I wasn't expecting to feel like this, Mark. I wasn't expecting you to become more than just a contract. But I don't regret it. Not anymore. Mark looked at her, his heart suddenly heavy with emotions he hadn't realized he had been holding back. He wasn't just starting to fall for Eleanor. He had already fallen. And now that he understood how he felt, he realized that he had to be honest about it. I feel the same way, he said quietly, his voice sincere. I didn't expect this either. I came into this with one goal: financial security for my family, but somewhere along the way, it became about something more. It became about you. Eleanor's eyes softened, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw something like relief in her gaze. But before either of them could say more, there was a knock at the door. Eleanor's assistant entered, a polite smile on her face. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Brooks, but you have a meeting in 20 minutes. Are you ready? Eleanor glanced at Mark, her smile returning to its usual composure. Of course, thank you, Claire. She turned to Mark, her expression soft but purposeful. I'll be back soon, she said, standing up. Let's continue this conversation later. Mark nodded, watching her as she left the room. As the door closed behind her, he sat back in his chair, a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just a man bound by a contract. He was a man with feelings that were slowly, but surely, taking root. But he didn't want to rush it. He had to let things unfold naturally. Eleanor had been through a lot, and so had he. They both needed time to figure out what they meant to each other. Later that evening, after her meeting, Eleanor invited Mark to join her in the garden. It was a warm night, and the stars were scattered across the sky like diamonds. They sat together on a bench, the sound of crickets and distant city noise filling the air. I've been thinking, Eleanor said, her voice quieter now. About what you said earlier. About where this is going. She turned to face him, her eyes thoughtful. I think we've both been holding back, out of fear of what it might mean, but maybe it's time to stop being afraid. Mark felt his pulse quicken at her words. He had been waiting for this, for her to say something that would let him know she felt the same way. What are you saying? He asked, his voice low. Eleanor took a deep breath before answering, her words slow and deliberate. I'm saying that I think we've both changed. And I think we owe it to ourselves to see where this goes. To stop pretending it's just a contract. Maybe we don't have all the answers, but we can figure it out together. Mark's heart raced, and for the first time since their marriage, he felt the weight of the possibility ahead of them. They could make this work. They could take that leap of faith, together. Together, Mark repeated, his voice full of meaning. Eleanor smiled, the warmth of it lighting up her face. Together. And in that moment, Mark knew that no matter what happened next, they had crossed the line from business partners to something more, something real. The future was still uncertain, but they were no longer bound by the past. They were ready to create something new, something worth fighting for. The days following that evening on the terrace were filled with a quiet anticipation. Mark and Eleanor's relationship had crossed a new threshold, one that neither of them had expected, but both were beginning to embrace. They spent more time together, not just in the grand spaces of the estate, but in the quieter moments. They'd walk the gardens, share cups of coffee in the mornings, and sometimes, just sit in silence, content in each other's presence. The tension that once defined their marriage seemed to dissolve, replaced by something warmer, more genuine. Eleanor's walls were slowly crumbling, and Mark found himself wondering if the woman he had married out of necessity was now becoming someone he truly cared for. One evening, as they sat in the study, Eleanor turned to him, her eyes serious but soft. "Mark, I've been thinking about what we talked about," she said quietly. "About us, about where we're going." Mark glanced up from the book he was reading, his heart suddenly racing. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice low. Eleanor set her book aside, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table. "I think we need to make a decision," she said. "We've been dancing around this for weeks, trying to figure out what we really want. But I think it's time to stop holding back." Mark leaned forward, his breath catching in his chest. He had been thinking about this too, about what they could be, about what they might have if they stopped pretending. But he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the reality of it. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice thick with uncertainty. Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I mean that we can't keep living in limbo," she said. "Either we accept that this is a real relationship, or we go back to what we were before. But I can't live like this forever, and I don't think you can either." Her words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Mark felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had spent so much time caught in the uncertainty of their situation that he hadn't fully realized how much it was affecting him. He had thought he could keep everything under control, that he could stay detached, but the truth was, he had already crossed a line. "I don't want to go back," Mark said, his voice low but firm. "I don't want to pretend anymore." Eleanor's expression softened, and for the first time in a long while, Mark saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She wasn't the powerful, untouchable woman he had first met. She was someone who was searching for something real, just like he was. "Neither do I," she whispered. The moment lingered, the silence between them filled with a new understanding. Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "So, what do we do now?" he asked. Eleanor squeezed his hand, her smile gentle. "We start by being honest with ourselves. About what we want. About what we feel. No more pretending." Mark nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. For the first time in their marriage, he felt like they were on the same page. They didn't have all the answers, but they were willing to figure it out together. That was enough for him. Over the next few days, Mark and Eleanor began to take small steps toward building something real. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the old insecurities crept in. But they were learning to communicate, to trust each other in ways they hadn't before. And with each passing day, they grew closer. They shared more than just conversations now. They shared their hopes, their fears, and their dreams. Eleanor began to open up about her past, about the family she had lost, about the loneliness that had driven her to make such an unconventional choice. Mark listened, not with judgment but with empathy, understanding that the woman sitting beside him wasn't just a business partner. She was someone who had endured pain, who had built walls to protect herself. And as he listened, Mark realized that he was falling for her in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the music they shared, the lessons, or the quiet moments in the garden. It was the way she made him feel like he mattered, like he was enough. That was something he hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, after a particularly intense conversation, Eleanor turned to Mark, her eyes shining with a quiet intensity. "Mark," she said softly. "I think I'm ready to take the next step." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Eleanor smiled, a slow, thoughtful smile. "I mean that I'm ready to let go of the past. And I think we're ready to build something real together. No more pretending. Just us." Mark felt a rush of emotions, relief, hope, and a deep sense of connection. For the first time, he truly believed that they could make this work. They had started this journey as strangers bound by a contract, but now, they were on the path to something more. Something real. "Together," Mark whispered, the word full of meaning. Eleanor nodded, her smile widening. Together. And in that moment, Mark knew that whatever happened next, they had already crossed the most important line, the line between pretending and truly living. The future was still uncertain, but now, it was something they would face together. It had been weeks since Mark and Eleanor had decided to move forward, to stop pretending and face whatever this was between them. Their time together felt different now. There was an ease in their interactions, a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. Eleanor had begun to open up in ways that Mark never expected. She shared stories about her past, about the struggles she had faced before the wealth, before the loneliness. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the woman behind the mask of a businesswoman. Mark, in turn, found himself revealing more of himself to his dreams, his fears, his family. They were slowly building something real. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching the sunset, Eleanor turned to Mark, her eyes reflecting the soft golden light. "Mark, there's something I've been thinking about," she said, her voice steady but carrying a hint of uncertainty. Mark looked at her, his heart rate picking up slightly. "What is it?" he asked, his tone gentle. Eleanor hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I think we've come a long way since we first agreed to this arrangement. We've built something maybe not perfect, but something real. And I think it's time we take the next step." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He knew this moment was coming, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel more real than ever. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already had an idea. Eleanor smiled, a mix of warmth and vulnerability in her expression. "I mean, it's time for us to stop hiding behind the walls we've built. We've spent so much time being cautious, being careful, but I think it's time we trust each other fully. I'm ready to take the leap, Mark. I want to see where this could go beyond the contract, beyond the business deal. I want to build a future with you." Mark's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't find the right words. They had both been so guarded, so unsure about what this relationship truly was, but now Eleanor was offering him a chance to be something more. He could see it in her eyes. She was ready, and for the first time, so was he. "Eleanor," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I don't want to go back either. I've been holding back too, but now I see it. I see us. I want to be with you truly, fully." Eleanor's eyes softened, and she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You don't know how much that means to me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The moment between them felt like it was suspended in time, a delicate balance between everything that had been and everything that could be. They had started as strangers, brought together by necessity. But now, they had something that was entirely their own, something neither of them had expected, but both were willing to embrace. As they sat there, hand in hand, the evening air cool against their skin, Mark realized that the future, though uncertain, no longer felt daunting. He wasn't alone in this anymore. They had each other, and together, they could face whatever came next. Eleanor turned to him, a slight smile on her lips. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice soft and filled with possibility. Mark looked into her eyes, a sense of calm settling over him. "Now, we take it one step at a time," he said, his voice steady with resolve. "No more pretending. We build something real, together." Eleanor's smile widened, and in that moment, Mark knew they had crossed a threshold. They weren't just living in a marriage of convenience anymore. They had created something that was theirs, a love built on trust, honesty, and the willingness to take risks. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. And that was enough. Months passed, and Mark and Eleanor's relationship grew stronger with each passing day. What had started as a business arrangement had now transformed into something deep, something neither of them had expected. They were no longer just partners bound by a contract. They had become a team, supporting each other through both the challenges and the joys of life. Mark had found a new purpose in this unexpected relationship. His confidence had grown, not just from the financial security Eleanor had provided, but from the love and trust they had built together. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first walked into this marriage. Eleanor, too, had changed. The walls she had so carefully built around her heart had slowly come down, piece by piece. She had let Mark in, and with him, she had rediscovered the kind of love she had long believed she couldn't have. It was a love not born out of need or obligation, but out of genuine connection and shared experiences. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace, watching the sunset, Mark turned to Eleanor, his heart full of emotions he couldn't quite express. "I never thought I would find this," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "I came into this thinking it was just a way out, a solution to my problems. But now, I can't imagine my life without you in it." Eleanor smiled, her hand reaching out to take his. "I never thought I could feel this way again," she replied softly, "but you've shown me that it's possible. You've helped me open up in ways I never thought I could." Mark squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of their journey together. It hadn't been easy. There had been doubts, fears, and moments of uncertainty, but they had made it through, together. "We've come a long way," he said, looking out at the horizon. "From where we started, I never thought we'd be here." Eleanor nodded, her eyes meeting his with a tenderness that took his breath away. "Neither did I. But here we are. And I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." For a moment, they simply sat in silence, letting the peace of the moment wash over them. The future was still unknown, but for the first time, they both felt ready to face whatever came next. "I want to make this official," Mark said, his voice low but filled with determination. Eleanor looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" she asked. He took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple, elegant ring, a symbol of the love they had built together. "I want to marry you, Eleanor. For real this time. Not because of a contract, but because I love you." Eleanor's eyes widened, and for a moment, she was speechless. The weight of his words settled around them, and she realized that this wasn't just a gesture, it was a promise. A promise that they were no longer just bound by a contract, but by something far stronger. "Mark," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know what to say." He smiled gently, his heart racing. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just know that I love you. And I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Eleanor looked at the ring, then back at him, her heart swelling with emotion. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, I will marry you." Mark's heart soared as he slipped the ring onto her finger, the weight of the moment settling in. They weren't just two people who had come together out of necessity anymore. They were two people who had chosen each other, fully and completely. As they kissed under the fading light of the sunset, Mark knew that they had crossed a threshold, one they could never go back from. The past, the contract, the doubts, they were all behind them now. They had built something real, something lasting, and no matter what came next, they would face it together, hand in hand, knowing that they had found the kind of love that could withstand anything.